I'm kind of wishing we did a PowerPoint.
So
We
Michelle,
have something to watch.
thank you for all the info for St. Mary's.
Oh, hopefully it's helpful.
They are.
We won't take so
Doing
long.
cool things.
Are you ready to go?
I would show is here.
Yeah.
You guys,
What happened in August?
no, Irma's standing right there, and Howard's right
So
there.
Ready to go? Are we going somewhere?
here's the breakdown of the
I
items.
think we're going to get started.
Okay.
We're ready to
Howard?
resume. Howard.
Zoom so we can.
Approved.
Before we get going, I just did want to point out, I went and talked to staff. I didn't want to drag out the conversation, but one of the criteria they did not mention explicitly, but when we had our conversation, I'm really pleased to hear is in there, is meeting multiple purposes with each project. I think it's
Yeah.
a really critical criterion.
Yep.
Multiple objectives.
It's a good criteria because they don't get single-purpose
Yeah,
projects.
it's like, forget the single purpose stuff.
Next, we have recap 6. Tracy Morgan.
I think I just got you a grant in the last.
Excellent work, Howard. Thank you very much.
So, and that's a common mistake, but it's actually Morgan Tracy.
Is it Morgan Tracy? Did I read that wrong?
He's
Morgan
the
Tracy.
anti-Tracy Morgan.
I read it backwards.
And actually, I'm gonna open up the briefing. Evening, Chairman Bao and the members of the Planning Commission. My name is Phil Namany with Bureau of Planning Sustainability. And Morgan Tracy, who's a project manager for Regulatory Improvement Code Amendment Package 6, or Recap 6, is sitting here off to my right. We also have Jill Grenda from Bureau of Development Services, in case there's any kind of questions that come up about implementation. BDS has been a partner with us as we've been moving through developing the work plan and the code amendments. So I'm going to, I'm kind of battling a frog in my throat the last few days, but I'm going to provide sort of a general overview of Recap 6 since we last met, both kind of the process and kind of some of the research that we did. And then Morgan's going to go into a little bit of detail on some of the key issues and initiatives that we've worked on so far. I do want to mention this is still kind of in a summary discussion draft briefing state. So we did not provide you with what we have currently put out as a discussion draft because potentially that will have some elements that may change before we come back to you later this spring. But we do have a summary sheet that we've passed out. And also during the spring, of course, that's when we'll have opportunity for public comment and everything. So just to kind of bring a quick summary and background. If you recall, recap or regulatory improvement code amendment packages are an ongoing process that we've been using to continuously improve and update our city development codes. And they've been going on since 2003 in one form or another. There was a funding gap for about the last 3 years from 2010 to 2013 where the program wasn't funded. And then with the 2013 budget, we were able to bring this back on track and started working on the current proposal, Recap 6. And if you recall, in August of last year, we brought forward a work plan that had 42 items on it that we were asking for your approval to move forward on. And that was granted at that time. So since that vote in August, we've gone through and we've actually done a lot of research on all the items. We've reviewed case history, if there's situations where land use cases were relevant to the issue. We've looked at reviewed the history of the policy and the history of the codes to kind of get a background for what the status was and what the reasoning was for the original code. We also talked to various other bureaus and stakeholders about those issues. And so from that, we started formulating decisions on whether we're going to move forward on code amendments or not on those 42 items. During that time, we also were receiving some pressure to add items to the package for several items. And we did actually agree to add, take a look at 3 other items that Morgan's going to go over with that were sort of felt that were critical in terms of their timing to look at this point rather than to wait for a future recap. but Morgan will go over that a little bit in the upcoming minutes. So from that research, we did develop a discussion draft at the beginning of this month that we put out for public release that provided proposed amendments to many of the things. It also proposed to not amend about 25% of the issues. And the summary on the handout, you'll see that we kind of divided up by sort of some items that have a slight minor policy impact, some items that are mostly clarifications or technical fixes, and then in the sort of the lower right-hand corner are the items that we are proposing to not amend. And so we're welcome to, welcome questions after Morgan's done on any of those items. But that's sort of how the things are laid out. So with the discussion draft release, we have kind of gone through a little tour of neighborhood coalitions and other agencies. We've talked to DRAC, and we're in the middle of sort of going through and discussing with all the district coalition offices and some of the neighborhood association offices that are neighborhood associations that have a desire to talk about some of the issues with us. And moving forward with that, we're going to probably continue doing that for the rest of January and into February. We do have an open house scheduled for February 11th here in this building, and we've sent out a notice to over 700 individuals, as well as the neighborhood associations, coalition offices, and other people interested in legislative projects, inviting them to come to that. After we host open house and finish having the meetings, we will be closing sort of the comment period for the discussion draft on February 21st. We'll be kind of taking the comments and reviewing those, making changes where we feel it's necessary, and from that we expect to release the proposed draft in March, and that will be the draft that we'll bring forward to the Planning and Sustainability Commission. And currently we have that tentatively scheduled for April 22nd, which is an evening meeting. So what we anticipate is that you will have the chance on April 22nd to then hear testimony on the issues, discuss them, and determine if you want to make a recommendation to move forward on all of them, or if you want to bring some back to discuss further. But that's where we're at this point. I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic to Morgan so that he can talk about some of the issues that we've been hearing the most kind of discussion and comments on so far.
Can I just interject real quick? I do want to encourage you to, I don't want to say pay attention, but to,
You're looking at Howard,
I was looking at you, you're taking a little nap, but no, I would really like to, when we bring this on at the end of April 22nd, to be able to look at it, and if possible, to have asked a lot of questions beforehand so that you can take a vote, because recap is about making quick change. And I want us to be known for being able to be decisive, put these things into motion and to have it basically in code, by the next fiscal year, July 1st. And so that means we kind of have to get it voted on to be able to get it to city council then in May, and then have it become part of the code before July 1st. So obviously, if there's big issues and we need to keep talking, we need to do that. But otherwise, it would be great to be responsive, because that's part of the program.
As part of that process, and maybe this is a little bit too early, but the last time we did this, we had certain items that were just kind of yeses automatically, and other items we wanted to discuss. And if we could do that process, that would probably move us forward a lot quicker. So if we can have, maybe in the March of, like, if people can get a sense of whether or not they have heartburn or major questions at that draft and get them back to staff, we can get those questions answered. And if they don't, we kind of get a sense of what can move forward pretty easily, and then what you may need more work on at that time. So we get an early look at it. Not saying we're making decisions, but as we come back with the proposed draft.
Well, and I think our hope even at this meeting is that if there's some issues that you have some burning questions on, that we can already get sort of a head start on, because I said, we do have a discussion draft out that does have some proposed code language. And, there's some things I recall back, and I might be stealing Morgan's thunder, but things like there was some discussion about fence heights and what we should do about fence heights. And actually what we ended up not doing is, at least for that aspect, we're proposing to not amend the code. And so the question is, if there's some questions about that you want more discussion about why on that, that's something we can come back and be prepared to give you a little more detailed response on.
Yeah, I was contacted by a couple folks who were very active in the neighborhood associations expressing some concern, and my advice to them was to get their concerns to you if they wanted to let us know what their concerns were as well. I haven't heard anything back, so I was just curious. I'm assuming you've had some communication recently with.
That's perfectly appropriate. Actually, so as Phil mentioned, we're currently in our discussion draft comment period. We've had a number of neighborhood meetings. We're hearing from a number of interested people on several issues, which I'll touch on in a moment. But at this point, we're just collecting those comments, responding to answers, clarifying their questions so they can make more informed comments. And those will help shape the proposal that you guys will see. So I think that's, if you are hearing from your constituents, direct them to us and we'll deal with those. Yeah, so Phil did steal part of my thunder, but I still have a little bit left. Since we are going to be returning in April with a formal proposal for you guys, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time going into the weeds on these items, but I just kind of want to highlight sort of the 10,000 foot level of detail on these particular issues. So the one that we're getting a lot of interest and attention on is the bed and breakfast short-term rentals issue.
Small issue.
We're not surprised.
You're not surprised, yep. So it's generated a lot of conversation. It's interesting, the conversation sort of falls on one of two sides, but essentially, just to kind of paint the picture a little bit, our current code, if you're located in a residential zone and you're renting rooms on anything less than a monthly basis, you're required to go through a conditional use review process through our bed and breakfast regulations, which is about a $4,100 application process, and it takes about 2 months. This would allow you to rent up to 5 bedrooms through that conditional use review, depending on the outcome of the review process. So what we've seen since the initial bed and breakfast regulations went into effect, there's a large increase in the number of Airbnb listings, or those sort of short-term rental listings. About 3 years ago, there were 100 listings on Airbnb. Today, we have over 1,400. So we're interested in staying ahead of that trend, being out in front of it, and trying to develop the appropriate level of regulation to address those situations. So what we're proposing at this point is carving out a subset of those B&Bs that are intentionally limited in scale, 1 and 2 bedroom facilities, would be allowed with a permit similar to what we allow with the Type B home occupation permit. Type B home occupations are businesses operated out of a house that allow up to 8 customers to come to the site per day. So it's sort of in the same range of impact as a home occupation. The process would require that neighbors be notified, including the applicant's contact information. So that's intended to spur a conversation, address concerns early on. The permit would be issued over the counter, so significantly reduces the review time, and is about $150. So on one hand, we've heard from people that this is a good thing and that it will create a streamlined process for the nearly 1,400 properties that are listed, offers more options for travelers, offers more options for people that are intending to age in place. There are more income options for their properties. On the concern side, we have concerns about intrusions of commercialization or intrusions into the residential zones. Concerns about parking, noise, other nuisance issues, and security. So as we're gathering all these comments together, we'll lay those out in our proposed draft and try to demonstrate how we've addressed those comments.
Morgan, question about the scope of what we're doing. I had somebody from the community contact me around this issue, and their concern was that exactly what was it we were sort of making more streamlined. And they were separating, I think, the land use approval, which is what I think we're doing, versus the life safety issues like, do you have to have a smoke detector? Do you have to have, emergency egress? Am I correct in believing we're not touching those issues? Those all still apply, that we're just looking at the land use. Are you allowed to use your property for this purpose?
Yeah, so the intention is, from the land use standpoint, from the zoning code regulations, the code would allow you to use 1 or 2 bedrooms. Bedrooms are defined in the building code as having particular requirements. This process, as it currently stands, wouldn't require a building inspection, a life safety inspection, a fire marshal inspection. But we have heard that comment raised, the concern raised.
Morgan, maybe during this process, we can get into a conversation about enforcement and awareness. How do you even know these businesses are out there? How do you know this is, do you go on Craigslist or something? I don't know how you do enforcement. So maybe we could talk about that a little bit too.
Yeah, and maybe Jill would comment or pitch in a little bit also, but you don't want to.
Are you the enforcer? Jill?
No. But I do represent BDS, and what we've been tentatively talking about is using an existing type of process, the home occupation permit process, which is
Right.
already developed in our permit system, so we could just sort of put a little twist in that to add the B&Bs as a subtype of that. It does, so it's the code enforcement arm of BDS that would issue those permits, and they do the home occ permits. And there would be a single inspection, just they would go out and sort of look and make sure that the scale of the B&B was what the applicant had described in their application.
That it's safe, yeah.
Well, they're not checking safety. So mind you, this is not a building permit, it's essentially a type of a zoning permit.
It's like a use permit.
Exactly, yeah. And right now, I don't think what's in the discussion draft limits it. So home occupation permits have to be renewed on, I think, a biannual basis. So you guys, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no proposal right now for these to be renewed, these B&B permits, if you will. Is that correct?
In the discussion draft, that is correct. Yeah, and that's something that's under discussion.
Okay.
So to go back to my life safety question, so what I think I heard is, if I had a bedroom I could put one of my family members in, I can rent it out. But if I converted a basement to add a bedroom that didn't have proper emergency egress, who calls follow on that?
Yeah. So like complaint driven or?
Yeah, as is just about everything in our zoning code, it's a complaint-driven process. So typically, we would find out about those from some disgruntled guest that showed up and found that the accommodations were not to their suiting and were suited for them, and they would complain, and we would then investigate.
Hopefully not a guest who was trapped in a fire.
Yeah.
I think the complaint system occurs, I don't think it's necessarily triggered by the fact of whether you're renting a room for a short-term basis or renting it as for a roommate. I think the idea of whether you convert, your garage illegally to living space or the basement area, that's going to be a compliance issue regardless of how it's used. And I think that's why, and Jill, you may know a little bit more about sort of the actual B&B regulations and how they work with the building code, but I think that's why our B&B regulations have an allowance only up to 5 bedrooms, because once you start renting more than that, it triggers, I think, the commercial code, and then they really are looking at things about ADA accessibility and, having an escape route and things like that. I think under that, I think the building code actually still looks at that as this is chiefly a single dwelling residence that's being used as a household.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. What I remember from the discussion of the bed and breakfast, and I might be wrong, I thought that a lot of people felt like the economy's doing really, really poorly. We're in a recession. We're trying to do whatever we can economically within our homes to try to, pay our mortgage, whatever, and that the numbers did go up from 107 to what, 1,300 you have on here of people actually renting a room.
Right.
So my concern would be, I like what you have as a thoughtful plan. What we don't want is you saddle it with so many requirements that you go back to 102. And some neighborhoods are like, forget it, I'll let my house go into foreclosure, f it, I'm not gonna try to keep it. You wanna do the opposite of that, and I'm leaving. So, I just wanna be.
It's her last meeting.
My last
Let's
straw.
be clear.
So I just wanna be really cautious that when you're having these conversations, that there is, I mean, Chris has a point, but you have to kind of think about what was the intent of the policy to begin with.
Yeah.
And the more that you add to it that's cost and burdensome, some people are gonna not be able to do it.
Or they're gonna bootleg it.
Yeah. They're gonna do it underground and it's
Which
not
is what
gonna-
they're doing
not
now.
gonna come out and try to get these easy permits.
That's exactly right. And I think the permit, part of the benefit of having a permit process, and some people have asked along the way, why even bother with a permit? It just allow them. Part of the benefit of having that permit process is to have that interaction so we can talk about what the life safety requirements are so that they're aware of what, and forewarn certain people or certain applicants about, your insurance obligations and, communicating with your landlord if you're a tenant that, your owner probably needs to know that you're subletting your property. So it allows that opportunity
Yeah.
as well as having the ability to communicate with your neighbors, I think is a real.
Well, and I think what you're gonna end up having, I think, is you're gonna have some great education that goes out to people in the neighborhood. You're always gonna have the person, the neighbor that's really nervous. I remember when we lived in Laurelhurst, we had a neighbor come knocking with a little permit that we had to sign, that he was an attorney and he might have clients come to his house. And Steve and I were like, wow, we have to sign this. That was the first time we ever knew that existed. We thought, but what a great little process. And if you do something simple like that, you're gonna have more people interested and it might generate a lot more income for the city. I mean,
So
gotta
Irma,
be
that was
careful.
because he had a home office,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So I think it's
So it'd
very
be
similar
similar.
to that. That's what I'm
Yeah.
envisioning.
Good.
Yeah.
So,
And we essentially borrowed much of the language and the process from the home occupation permit.
Makes sense.
But because we already had a chapter on bed and breakfast, we just sort of migrated that aspect of it over to the bed and breakfast
And
chapter.
it was a great idea because then Steve and I were like, well, what kind of attorney are you? And then it creates this kind of
Dialogue.
self-fulfilling economic boost for the area. And I think, it's still renting a room, but I think that I would be really cautious on burdening it with too much of anything.
You also raised another important point about the education piece. So I would, we haven't talked to all 1,400 of these listings, but I would venture a guess that most of them don't realize that they're not operating in compliance with our zoning requirements. So having that permit, once you see something from your neighbors, oh, I didn't even know the city had this process. So it also benefits us that way.
just and a clarification on this one in particular, this is not a revenue policy, correct?
It-
Right, room tax.
It
Huh?
is
Well, I
a-
mean, I'm just,
Sort of.
I'm asking the question.
It's not being driven by revenue.
Not the $150, I get that, but the room tax, I'm thinking room tax here.
the revenue requirement or the revenue, the room tax will be applied to this, just as it currently is applicable, but almost no one's paying it. And so, companies like Airbnb all go through when you rent from them, it all goes through goes through Airbnb. You don't do it directly with the person. So they've already talked with the Airbnb company just to let them know, and they're fine with it. They're like, that makes sense. Everybody should pay the 8%, 10%, 12%, on it. If they're not in unfair competition for hotels, it makes it a level playing field. That won't be as easy to get for other companies like that where you do it directly with an owner. And the revenue department realizes that, but they do intend to, and have already sent letters, is my understanding, to some of the companies to let them understand that currently they're required to pay this.
But if you get a permit, we now know where you are.
But if you're Airbnb, we already know where you are.
Well,
Because it's all
Oh,
one
yeah.
thing.
okay.
I mean, we don't.
Actually, the notice does have kind of a two-pronged aspect on it. One is the kind of the transparency aspect with neighbors and so on. But the other piece is, we see that as the opportunity, if we get the application in and we've stamped it as, yes, you're approved to run this one or two room B&B, we can essentially forward that information or forward the file numbers to the Revenue Bureau. And then it's up to them about how diligent they're going to be in terms of getting the lodging tax. But the lodging tax is already on the books, that if you're renting for more than 14 days in a calendar year, you are supposed to pay a transient lodging tax. So we're not changing the policy on that. We're just essentially providing this step that maybe allows us to track that a little better.
Okay, thank you. Do you have more to there?
I've got several more.
Well, Michelle
I was
has
just
a
going to throw
question.
in a quick textual thing.
bet.
So in that code, you talk about it's bed and breakfast facilities where one individual or a family resides in a dwelling. Do you mean to say family or do you mean to say household?
So in our code, we define family. It relates to the definition of household living. And our intention there is that what's allowed in terms of the occupancy of that house isn't any different than what's normally allowed with a family. So 5 unrelated individuals in addition to a family. So we've, the second one, second item, which I was anticipating there would be a little more discussion on, and there hasn't been to date, which is sort of surprising, is addressing the cell tower, the radio frequency transmission facilities. Currently, our code includes provisions that regulate cell facilities based on radio frequency emissions, including standards that are inconsistent with the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC. It uses power output, or ERP, to establish thresholds for review, whether a facility is exempt, allowed, or has to go through a conditional use review. And it also includes subjective language that speaks to no significant visual impact when facilities are being modified. So in terms of our code, when we're applying standards on the counter, terms like no significant visual impact is a pretty discretionary standard. So our proposal would replace the city's emission standards with a requirement to document compliance with the FCC's emissions limits. It distinguishes the review thresholds based on the type of facility, so it takes that ERP language, the power output language, and replaces it with what we're really talking about is personal wireless service facilities, cell phones, cell towers, and radio broadcast towers, like things up on the hill. So rather than using this line in the sand, which doesn't relate to the FCC regulations and kind of could create other problems with how we apply the code, we've created 2 classifications for those facilities, cell sites and radio towers. And we've also added objective standards to address how existing facilities are being modified instead of using the subjective visual impact language. I think it's important to note, and maybe this is why we're not hearing a lot of comments on this particular issue, is that we're not changing the type of thresholds of review that are applied currently. So if it's a type 3 CU today, it would be a type 3 CU when we're done. If it's exempt today, it's exempt with the proposal. So we're not touching that part. It's really addressing portions of the code that are inconsistent with the 1996 Federal Telecommunications Act. Thirdly, we're addressing temporary uses, and this is really trying to get this chapter caught up to date. It hasn't really been touched very frequently since it was adopted in 1991. So it's a little out of date, and especially in light of our recent notoriety as a star location for commercial filming, shows like Grimm and, well, recently Leverage, Portlandia. So commercial filming is currently not addressed at all in the zoning code, although we have regulations that apply in the right-of-way, so street closure permits and those sorts of things are addressed by PBOT. But there was nothing in our code that really spoke to these temporary activities that happen on private property. So we're proposing to add commercial filming as a temporary activity, and it's defined in terms of its length of use or length of duration on a site, and we require a break in that activity to occur after the filming is completed to ensure that it's a temporary activity, not an ongoing permanent use. We're also dealing with off-site staging areas for construction sites. So these are small development sites in high-intensity zones, RH, RX, central commercial zones, generally very small sites, big buildings, no place to put the stuff. So this would allow for some off-site staging to occur within a specified distance of the construction area just to facilitate that development, and then requires the site to be restored to its prior condition when they're done.
So, Morgan, quick question on that one. That caught my attention is that you limit it to a year, yet a lot of big buildings take more than a year to build. So what was the logic in that limitation of a year?
If you look at the staging requirements for public utility installation projects, which allows up to 3 years.
Right.
At 1 year, there's a requirement that you have a liaison, a community liaison to interact and address issues with the neighborhood and so forth. So one potential change is we could extend that time period, but we'd want to look at how that mirrors or lines up with how we do public utility installation. So for simplicity's sake, we dropped it a year, but I understand what you're saying about that may not be long enough.
Yeah, I would say it's not long enough. So it might be just something to research more. And, most of the towers we've been building are 24 months construction at least. So, not that they're staging that whole time or needing that whole area, but it's going to be more than a year, I think.
And I have heard a comment from BDS along that line as well. So that's something we'll look at.
Question.
Michelle, go ahead.
How long is a break in a break? How long is a break before it becomes a break in the activities?
So it varies, but by and large, for most of these temporary activities, the break in time has to be 4 times the time that the activity occurred. So if it occurred for a week, you'd have to wait 4 weeks before you
So
returned.
if I stop for the weekend, is that a break in activity? If I'm filming half the season and then I take a month off?
So if your if you're filming for 6 months, then you'd have to take 24 months before you return to that particular site. It's based on how long your filming activity was, and then you go 4 times that time before you can return.
I get that. I guess I'm just not clear. It seems to me you might end up with an issue of arguing over what's a break. How much time can they stop? If they take 2 weeks off or something, is that going to?
And that's one of the things that, like with the commercial filming, we didn't actually put a time limit on it because, essentially if they took a weekend off, but they, filmed Monday through Friday and then filmed the next Monday through Wednesday, let's say, we would probably look at that as all one activity because we don't necessarily say that there's a maximum. Both Morgan and I have talked quite a bit with the one from PDC who kind of helps coordinate and promote the film, kind of the film location and the industry that's working on finding places to film on location. And what we gathered from her is even when they're filming things like a television series, since they usually know what they're going to film for the various episodes and when they're going to film on location, they will tend to take maybe 3 days. And it's usually, it's rare that they're even there for 5 days. And so if they're filming something at somebody's house, they may be filming, that morning they're filming, episodes 2 scene there, and then in the afternoon they're filming episode 6 scene there, and then evening they're filming the, finale or whatever. It may not even be order, but a lot of times she had mentioned that they may spend 1 day setting up, 1 day filming, and then 1 day taking down, and then they're not there for 6 months.
So sort of in the interest of time, I'm going to move us along here. Phil did steal my thunder on the fence regulations. There was a lot of conversation we had at the work plan hearing on this item, some effort to remove the items from the work plan, and we ended up including it. But essentially, I just wanted to give you an update on where we landed on that. So after completing our research, we found that the problems that were identified in our regulatory improvement database, and this isn't totally a surprise because some of those items were very old, they were no longer relevant. So we found that issues about the availability of stock building materials being in 3.5-foot height increments, were available, they weren't available, 15, 20 years ago. Areas that were annexed 20 years ago that had a 4-foot height limit, they've probably rebuilt a number of their fences. We did a little research on other cities surrounding us. We found that there was no common standard. We had 3, 3.5, 4-foot fence heights for the front yard. For daycare, play areas, and public swimming pools, there is a state requirement that the fences be 4 foot tall, but we found that this would impact a negligible number of properties. First, that the fences that are located outside of that front setback can be taller than 3.5 feet. And secondly, not too many areas are going to have play areas or swimming pools in the front yard. And creating a standard to address that small segment of properties is really just sort of adding additional complexity to the code that the adjustment process is really designed to address. We looked at numbers of land use cases. There weren't any adjustments for 4-foot fence heights. Code compliance cases, we had a number of 6-foot fence height violations, but not this difference between 3.5 and 4 feet. So essentially, based on the lack of a demonstrated current need to change the regulation and add complexity to a already fairly lengthy set of fence standards, we decided to not move an amendment forward for that particular item. Yes, but now we've done the research and we can put a nail in that one. So Phil mentioned that there were 3 items that were added on after the work plan hearing. I think it's just important to kind of touch on what those are so you understand what the context is. The first is having public art as an option for ground floor windows. So in commercial and in central employment zones, there's a requirement that buildings have 50% of their ground floor length, the length of the ground floor wall in windows to improve the pedestrian experience along the sidewalks and restrict the fortress-like facade at the street level. Currently, applicants who receive approval from the Regional Arts and Culture Council for public art may apply for a second approval for a land use adjustment to place public art instead of meeting the ground floor window requirement. So this proposed change would remove the second layer of that approval process by allowing RAC-approved public art without a land use adjustment. It's important to note that this change only applies to areas outside the Central City Plan District, since requests in the Central City Plan District are going to typically be associated with design review and incorporated in that review process. So really this is intended to promote or incent people to be able to use public art and remove one layer of the regulatory approval process for those applicants.
And RAC feels okay about this?
RAC wanted this. RAC was the one who
So
suggested it.
this would go in corridors.
I'm sorry?
This would go in corridors?
This would be applied to corridors. I think the other point to note is that if you already have a design overlay and you're going through design standards, one of the options for design standards is to do public art in lieu of ground floor windows without an adjustment. So it's putting all those situations sort of on a even keel.
And I don't want to discuss it, but I'd be interested to see what like the neighborhoods feel about that relative to, I'm thinking about places like Division Net have just kind of popped up, and whether or not, because design standards out in neighborhoods is a big issue and people want those and they want more control, and this seems to be heading in the wrong direction and in a corridor, just by initial look. So I'd be interested to know what the neighborhoods are thinking about it as they look at corridors and how the buildings will develop in those corridors.
And one of the things to kind of keep in mind on this is, this is something that RAC wanted to have to kind of, because they go through a fairly lengthy process to determine whether public art is a feasible and a logical thing to put in an area. And oftentimes what they're looking at when they're talking about on a building like this is maybe something like a mural as opposed to a window. And we've been working with RAC, and I think they understand too that the idea is not that, if you have a piece of public art that's this size on your building, that you don't necessarily mean you can obliterate all of your window. They recognize sort of the aspect of that the art should, the public art that's going up essentially is replacing the one part of the window that would go there anyways. So it's not necessarily a blanket thing. They're definitely going to kind of be applying sort of a comparison test on that as they review it. And somebody has to be serious to go through the RAC process because they have to go through and get approval from RAC. They have to get, RAC has to agree to fund this. So RAC is looking at many of the same kind of criteria that somebody would be going through with an adjustment approval criteria. And when people have had to go through the adjustment approval criteria, they often, and it's something related to RAC, they often kind of look at RAC as, well, you're the expert, what do you think? Is this in the public realm, and meet that same criteria? And so I think we feel fairly comfortable that there'll be a.
Okay. Don and Howard and Owen.
Division's an interesting example, because there's been a lot of redevelopment and a lot of it's street front. And I think a lot of those projects were implemented using the community design standards, which is an expedient way to do infill development. Can you still do this art in lieu of facade and windows in the community design process?
Well, Morgan brought that up. This was something that we kind of discovered as we were going through the regulations, is at some point, the community design standards actually did get adjusted so that somebody could go through and propose public art, RAC public art as part of that process. And it's a little more prescriptive than what we're putting in the base zone. It literally does talk about kind of a square footage for square footage kind of aspect of it. Yeah. But what the thought was is those same kind of guidelines, they maybe wouldn't necessarily be quite so prescriptive, but that RAC would keep those same kind of guidelines in mind if they're looking at something that's not in the D overlay.
Neighborhood scale, yeah. Okay, thanks.
Howard?
Well, you and I, for once, disagree, or at least art is in the eye of the beholder. I think the whole idea of neighborhood is in what these things actually, what actually happens around facades, how things evolve, and it's kind of part of how the city moves forward. I also think RAC is a pretty good custodian of the public art overall, and trust their judgment. Like us, there are people that care a lot about how the community reacts to what happens and not just make it crazy for the most part. So maybe it's just how we all see how you improve the facade of the neighborhood.
I'm not against the art. Don't get me wrong. I'm all
Yeah,
for
I
the
said I
art.
was against the art.
I think you are, Andrew. You're against the art.
Anti-art for
Yeah,
sure.
I'm not anti-art. Yeah.
Yeah, now it's out. Now it's out.
I'm just looking at the issue of the equity
Yeah,
in some of the neighborhoods and saying,
is that right?
is that right?
Okay.
Yeah,
And
wait,
I'm just
okay.
asking for the neighborhoods to
Okay.
kind of weigh in and say, yeah,
What's the
we're okay with
Storefront.
what this looks like, or,
How do you say neighborhood?
yeah, how do you
Who
say
owns the
neighborhood?
neighborhood?
And do we want to,
One block
do we
deep?
want art in our neighborhood? There's cities that have taken advantage of art along their main streets and made that part of their downtown or neighborhood corridors. And so I think it's appropriate. So I don't want to belabor the issue. And
I think just to put a cap on that, ground floor window, the ground floor window requirement is a great thing. It allows a lot of visual penetration of the buildings. It adds visual interest. With public art, however, there is an opportunity for that art to reflect the culture of the neighborhood and celebrate that neighborhood. So
I agree.
In the best case scenario.
Are there, in the interest of time?
yeah, just a quick, real quick. So we're coming back to this, how the zoning code applies in the public right-of-way for certain types of resources. So the issue, if you are aware, the issue was prompted by the Vista Bridge and the need to put protective fencing along the Vista Bridge. And Vista Bridge being a historic landmark requires some sensitive contextual design treatments for whatever they end up doing to it. But in that discussion, it became apparent that our zoning code and the historic resource review process didn't apply to development and land uses in the right-of-way. And this was sort of a remnant from an earlier code amendment back in 1996 when we separated design zones from historic resource areas. Previously, the code said that the zoning code doesn't apply to the right-of-way except for certain particular instances, including environmental, greenway, and design districts. When we split those chapters apart, we didn't update that portion to apply the zoning code to historic resources. And so we're coming back and correcting that. But since it's been 18 years and it's a pretty significant policy, we have it listed as a minor policy change and not a clarification or a correction, although it kind of is more of a correction, but it's been a long time coming. And lastly, we have the comprehensive plan map amendments, which address statewide goals. This is another critical omission. When applicants or the city are amending our comprehensive plan map, the city is obligated to show that the proposal conforms to the statewide planning land use goals. This criterion is not listed in the current code. So this change will clarify that these goals are applicable criteria in the city's review process, which they are anyways, but now it makes it clear to applicants and others that we have to do that.
Okay.
And that rounds that out.
Questions?
Yeah, a quick one. On number 26 on page 3, I'm kind of curious where that came from. Was there a group that wanted to do restoration work that wanted basically to remove hurdles? Did the Bureau of Environmental Services weigh in on this and said, no, no, no? You may have good intentions, but we're concerned about you doing it correctly.
It was it was a suggestion from some of our environmental review staff who've seen these projects come through. There's if there are ways to streamline the process and incent, restoration to happen, that's always a good thing.
Right.
We did meet with the folks in BES to see if we could develop those standards, and what we determined was based on the variability of hydrologic conditions and public safety concerns and so on and so forth, developing a set of standards was not real practical to do. It's very site specific.
Right. That's
So
what I assumed.
That's where we ended up.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Other comments, questions? I have just a couple, spectator seating, the schools.
Number?
I lost the number. Anyway, my comment is just, just to see the schools, whether or not they're, I remember this came up a long time ago when I was here. They were concerned about the seating and the square footage calculation, how you did it. What their comments are relative to this.
We've not heard comments from the school districts or parks, Portland Parks, on this issue yet.
Okay.
But it was spurred by a concern. I think the school districts had noted that it basically clarifies how that square footage is calculated separately from other types of exterior improvements.
The right-of-way, in the right-of-way, the TSP connection, and whether or not, you just talked about, as I understand it, this will also affect in the future about street lighting and relative to zoning code for any improvements. Is that correct?
Potentially. So if you're in a design district
Yep.
currently, and you're doing non-standard improvements in the public right-of-way, those are subject to design review.
So that would be streetcar, rapid transit.
If they're non-standard improvements, and we're having this conversation about what exactly a non-standard improvement is.
Huh?
Could be a new standard.
It could be a new standard.
So I'm just asking the question.
So that's what already exists in the code. We took that same exemption and mirrored that for historic resources. So if you're doing a non-standard improvement in a historic district, that would be subject to historic resource review. But your question is getting at the heart of it. If you're, for streetlights, if you're doing a standard streetlight in a historic district, that's exempt from historic resource review, but the question is that appropriate? I mean, is that standard Cobra head light appropriate for a historic district? And certain historic districts have particular guidelines that would say differently. So that's still a conversation we're having.
Okay. And then the community design standards cross-reference relative to exterior materials for residential areas. Is that just cross-referencing, or is that wholesale change?
It's not intended to be a change at all. It's, right now, if you're doing projects in commercial employment and RHRX zones, high-density multi-dwelling zones and commercial zones, and you're doing, it's all residential, you have the option of using the standards that are specific to those zones, or you can use the standards that apply to multi-dwelling residential zones. When you go to the standards that speak to multi-dwelling residential zones, suddenly there's no real guidance on if you're doing projects in commercial zones. So like a buffer requirement, for example, says, oh, if you're located in this, in a R1 zone and you're across the street from an R5 zone, then you need to have a buffer. But it doesn't speak to if you're one of these sites that's using the standards from a commercial zone. So basically, we've clarified in those multi-dwelling zones that if you're happen to take advantage of these multi-dwelling zone standards and you're in one of these zones, you're subject to that same buffer requirement. And if you go back to the commercial zone standards, you'll find that same buffer requirement applies there. So it's not a change for them, it sort of gives clear guidance to people that are applying those standards.
Okay.
Yeah, we often call those, I think, a consistency change.
Oh, okay.
Ideas. The intent was to be consistent, and somewhere along the line it got.
Other questions?
Got inconsistent.
I think we're done.
Great.
Adjourned?
We'll see you in a couple months.
Thank you, Irma.
Hey, Morgan.
Oh, Irma, what a.
Irma, what, oh, but we're gonna miss you, baby.
Do you need a ride?
Aren't you glad you showed up?